Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today, let's look at this plant. The most frequent question that I see is actually, do you know what this Rhipsalis is? So this Rhipsalis, I've talked about it before on the channel, but I do sort of think that we have a pretty good idea of either what it is or what it is most closely related to. And it's really weird because as soon as I say it, most people are like, no. So I figured maybe what we would do is take a look at it today and maybe look at it through like my lens and why I think it is either this species or very closely related to this species. This plant was distributed quite a bit in the United States by a nursery called Tropiflora, that's in Florida. And when they originally distributed this plant, they distributed it under the name Rhipsalis Agudoensis. It is very much not Rhipsalis Agudoensis. Rhipsalis Agudoensis is actually like gigantic. It has a totally different growth pattern. It actually looks more like Rhipsalis pachyptera than anything else. It looks way, way different from this. And here is one that is Rhipsalis Agudoensis. And as you can see, it is a very different looking species. It's like really has pretty large clades. You know, you're really not going to mistake it for this. I'm not sure if it was some confusion over like pictures or what. You know, a lot of times with Rhipsalis, things are just really, really bad. When you have like really terrible pictures without a size reference in them, things can get really confusing and you can't tell if these are really small or really big or what. You just, you really can't tell anything. And so this is just way, way bigger, tends to grow more upright. It has very thick, rigid, kind of sturdy clades. Totally different species. So unfortunately, if you look around on the internet and you just type in Rhipsalis Agudoensis, you're going to come up with a whole bunch of plants that look like this, but it's totally incorrect. Later on, they changed the name to Rhipsalis affinis Goebeliana. And what they meant by that was that this is not Rhipsalis Goebeliana, but they thought that it was closely related to Rhipsalis Goebeliana. Now, I don't think that they're wrong. I know that a lot of people are probably like, what? No. But when you looked at like some of the phylogenetic sampling that was done, some of that testing, it showed, and much to everyone's surprise actually, it showed that Rhipsalis Ewaldiana and Rhipsalis Goebeliana were very closely related. I personally think that this is either just another specimen of Rhipsalis Ewaldiana or something that is very closely related to Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. So if we take a look at Rhipsalis Goebeliana, which is another one that faces a ton of confusion, but really shouldn't because it's pretty easily identifiable. One of the things that is very easy to distinguish usually with this versus others is that it has these margins like this, these like dentate margins. It kind of resembles holly or holly that has been eaten by deer and, gets those same kind of margins. Now you can see obviously not all of the margins are quite like that. What I have noticed is that under my growing conditions, it seems to be the norm. Even if I get a plant that is not quite growing like that, it will turn into that under my conditions quite quickly. This can get a little bit confusing because it can get darker, like lighter green. Typically you see it's this kind of real vibrant light green. But you do actually see some similarities. So let me point out some things about these. So you do actually see that this does produce these kind of like long skinny branches. Sometimes they're 3-angled, sometimes they're not. And then it kind of grows out like this. Now, while these plants don't quite do that exactly. They do kind of sometimes do something kind of like that. If you only look at the clades and you're like, this is way different, that's going to get into trouble. You really, really have to look at the flowers. And when you do a flower comparison between these, they're very similar looking. They're not exact, but they're similar looking. And so that is why I believe they eventually sort of changed their opinion about it and went with Rhipsalis affinis Goebeliana. Then, for some reason, a lot of people thought that this was Rhipsalis micrantha. Rhipsalis micrantha has a way different growing pattern than this. It looks totally different. So if we take a look at Rhipsalis micrantha form Ra'iorum, so it was this one that I'm sure that someone thought that it had some kind of resemblance to. I don't see it anyway. Not this particular clone, just a tiny bit sometimes in some places, but totally kind of different shape, different amount of areoles, just a totally white, way different growth pattern. Also, how about this crazy 3-angled elongated branch on this? How cool is that? But totally different. And the flowers, no real resemblance. They don't look very close to each other. And I, for a little while, wondered, and this was because my plant originally was not really growing the way that it is now. And I think that's one of the things that made this so hard to identify, is because in cultivation, it has what appears to be two very distinct, different overall growth patterns. So we can see these big long branches with like the little branchlets at the end. So this would be a dimorphic growth pattern with these long branches and all these little different branches that are shaped differently at the end. But my plant for a long time actually grew like this. More like growth hanging down like this, which was very, very confusing. In any case, like because mine was growing that way, there was a plant that I knew of from photographs that I thought looked kind of similar. And that was actually Rhipsalis cuneata subspecies australis. So australis does produce these little cute Phylloclades like this that actually do look really similar. But as I watched mine grow out, it was very obvious that it was not the same plant. Plus, I just re-reviewed all of the different pictures that I knew of, and it just doesn't have this growth pattern. And then it was just kind of like this really strange, duh kind of moment. I think when I was doing some of the phylogenetic flower arrangements for Rhipsalis, like putting them sort of in their relationship order, I looked at this and I realized that I had seen a plant with a flower that was really close, almost identical, and that was Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. However, it's not the Rhipsalis Ewaldiana that would be more like the type clone. And so I think this is where things get really, really confused and people are like, absolutely no way, no how. Because when we look at more of one that's like the type clone, it looks like this, you know, and people are like, no, that can't, it's just not. And yeah, I would say that's super confusing. If we take a step back and we just kind of look at the overall kind of morphology and growth pattern, there is really only one Rhipsalis that has that kind of morphology just in general. The long sort of basal branches that it produces like this, that are like, I don't know, 5-angled or so, maybe more. And then all of the little branchlets that it produces towards the end like this, this has the same growth pattern. The big difference is that these are typically 3-angled, whereas these seem to be predominantly flat. That's kind of, I think, where people are like, absolutely not, no way, no how. But what if we start taking a look at some of the other Phylloclades that are on here? Like, look at this one. This one's a little bit fatter, right? So we can see that that one's a little bit fatter. And if we start, you know, poking around at this guy a little bit, we'll find that there are some of these little branchlets like this that are not flat. They're actually three-angled. And like here, you can see there's a whole bunch of these. They're actually three-angled. So it almost kind of looks like the same kind of growth, except for it is flattened. And so here's the thing. We see this with other Rhipsalis species, and it doesn't cause this much confusion for people. So we actually see this with something like Rhipsalis micrantha with the different forms. So we just looked at form Rhyorum. Well, if we were to look at the standard form, we're going to see predominantly flat Phylloclades and sometimes three-angled Phylloclades. But if we look at Kerbergii, we see Phylloclades that are 3+ angled. And so this isn't so weird. This got kind of confusing specifically with these because for a long, long time, they actually never really found this growing in the wild. And they did not so long ago. And when they found it, the plants actually had white fruit because they were not producing betalains. It could have been because they were growing in the shade. It could have been because they were genetically born that way. Now, betalains are cool because betalains, they can actually go all throughout the plant and they can change colors of all different kinds of things in the plant. They can color the roots, they can color the stems, they can color the flowers, they can color the fruit. And they may not color all of those things. So it just depends on how this genetic makeup of that specific specimen is. We know that this plant produces white fruit. And one thing that I think that people overlook quite a bit when it comes to Rhipsalis and identification is actually the flower ovaries. So it's when you do like a deep kind of comparison of the flower ovaries, not necessarily in a fully ripe berry stage, but like all through the production, through the initial forming of the ovary, you know, like the initial forming of the flower when it dies, like with the unripe fruit, what does it look like? As it starts to swell and ripen, what does it look like? What's the size, the shape, you know, in like super detail. So this plant for me had never produced any kind of fruit actually, but this year it has some unripe fruit. There is a distinct kind of shape to this fruit. It's almost a little pear-shaped. It's got like a little rounded bottom, and then at the top it gets a little bit narrower, and it's actually quite small. So if we take this Ewaldiana, this more like type clone of Ewaldiana, and we take this fruit and we pull it in there and we kind of look at them and we look at them together, you can kind of see that there is some similarity there. There's kind of a similar size, kind of a similar shape. If we grab a different one, like this guy, because you can't just do this with one, FYI. You have to like kind of do it with quite a few. If we take this guy and we go like that, you can see those two, again, they actually are quite similar size, quite similar shape. So let's take a look at these other Rhipsalis that we found in cultivation that for a long time was kind of confusing because we didn't really think that they were Ewaldiana either, because they do look a little different. All right, so now we have one of these Ewaldiana that is a lot more like the ones that they found in the wild. There's still Rhipsalis Ewaldiana, but there's something immediately that we can see is look at the similarity in just sort of their color, just that alone. And we start to see something with this in particular. Notice how these clades, the Phylloclades on these, they're not always triangular. Sometimes they're flat. And then we can kind of see like the aerial arrangement on the Phylloclades. So we can see there's like, you know, only a small amount of aerials on each side. We still see 3 angled ones, but guess what? Even here, they're a little bit fatter. And so we start seeing something that just has a really similar growth pattern. It's just that these clades, they're bigger, but even if we look at the aerial placement and arrangement and everything, we can see that they're in the same places. It has about the same number. They're in the same general places. We can see that this particular plant is unruly and not cooperating. You know, we can see a lot of similar kind of growth. And then if we take a look at the fruit and we do that same kind of fruit comparison. Plants. It's like working with animals or children, you know. They don't cooperate. Okay, let's see. Yikesers. All right, so here we have the fruit there. And then if we pull this guy up again here and we put those fruit together, see what I mean? Like, they're pretty similar. These are very, very similar. So I have quite a few Rhipsalis Ewaldiana hanging out here. And I don't quite know if perhaps this was like, perhaps it was something that was seed grown. Perhaps it was like something that was wild collected. A lot of things could have gone down there. But I have one more of these here that I think is super interesting. So here is another here's another little Ewaldiana. This guy is like just a little baby plant that I don't really know where it came from. I just sort of end up with them from all over the place sometimes. But one of the things that I noticed about this particular plant was it was doing this thing. This thing where it was like growing down, not quite in the same, you know, long branch, little branchlets kind of way, but it was doing something that was very similar to the way that this one was doing this. So I just really think, oh, and then we get some of this kind of stuff too. Again, you know, we start poking around and we start seeing these little flat Phylloclades there. Is it Rhipsalis Ewaldiana? Maybe. It actually might just be like some weird clone of Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. Perhaps it's some kind of a form and it just really hasn't quite been described yet as that. I don't quite know because I'm not a botanist. I think that for me, like just having a really large collection and, you know, really looking very closely at those details and understanding, I think, the relationships, my conclusion on this is that it is very obviously very closely related to Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. So sometimes, because they're so closely related, their flowers can be so very similar. And that's actually the reason why I'm not, even their growth, but that's the reason why I'm not saying for sure that this is Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. If you wanted to call it something, like, you could basically say it's a Rhipsalis species that is very closely related to Rhipsalis Ewaldiana. Because I personally have never really been able to find it in any kind of botanical text or anything like that. If the plant was producing all of these betalains, more like the type clone was, it probably was growing in much stronger light for probably an extended period of time. And that might have actually made it so that it didn't need as much surface area to its phylloclades. So the phylloclades are naturally narrower, and we see that with the type clone. Now, some of these other ones, like the green ones like this, you know, perhaps they were actually growing in a much shadier place for an extended period of time, and that actually has caused the phylloclades to sort of get wider because it increases the surface area. And so perhaps this guy got even wider. I don't know if that's the case with that one. If you have enough of them and you sort of look at them through that lens, not necessarily about what's different, but like maybe what's the same or what's very similar, it might help a little bit with some of the identification. But those are my thoughts about this Rhipsalis. I hope that you have enjoyed this. Thank you for watching, and as always, happy cacti growing.